It's helped me travel between 2,000 and 3,000 miles per week and given millions of other people a greater freedom to move around. And the motorways helped close 6,000 miles of British railways. But in their times, as the railways spread their iron rails up and down the country, the way they were built, the way they were worked and the way people used them changed people's lives, even more so than cars and motorways. The story really begins here, on a line which still joins Liverpool and Manchester. Along here ran the first regular passenger service, the first intercity trains. At the beginning of the 19th century, Liverpool and Manchester were growing fast. Manchester was the centre of the textile industry, with new factories and machines driven by steam. And Liverpool had become one of Britain's busiest ports. Links between the two towns became very important. There was at that time one main road, now the A57. And there were several canals. The road couldn't carry really heavy goods and it cost you. They charged a toll. The canals were good for carrying weight, but they took roundabout routes and the owners put up their charges every year. Businessmen felt they needed a faster and cheaper form of transport, so they got together and decided to build a railway as straight as possible between the factories of Manchester and the port of Liverpool. And they gave the job to George Stephenson. He was to be the engineer in charge of the whole works. Even today, it would be a difficult line to build, but at that time, some of the problems seemed impossible. This train is crossing Chat Moss, 4 miles of marsh near Manchester. They still cut peat here today, and you can see just what the problem was. Sopping. Oh, we've been trying to drain this land for 150 years, and as you can see, it's still wet. Stephenson was determined to build a railway across it. Engineers said it couldn't be possible. Anything put on top of this bog would just disappear and sink away. In one spot, the workmen poured in earth and stones day after day for 3 months, and the marsh just swallowed it up. So they tore down trees and laid them crisscross over the bog. On the trees, they put more rubble and stones. And then, the rails. The track was really floating on the marsh. They took 3.5 years to build the 4 miles of Chat Moss, but it held firm and it still holds today. At the other end of the line, Stephenson had quite a different problem. Olive Mount, a solid stone hill. With only picks and shovels and crude gunpowder, the men cut their way through. The marks of the chiselling can still be seen. Since then, the cutting has been widened, but at first it was just 20 feet across with 2 lines of track. It's a mile long, a mile through solid rock, and 70 feet down at its deepest point, and it was built by men with no modern machines. The railways were built with simple tools and sheer strength. The men who did the work were called navvies, casual workers who travelled wherever there was work. They were tough men, hard drinkers and hard fighters. As the line spread, they moved with them, living in shanty towns by the side of the track. Quiet village people dreaded their arrival and were glad to see the back of them. A navvy could move 20 tons of earth a day with just his shovel.
I am a navvy bold that's tramped the country round, sir, to get a job of work where any can be found, sir. I left me native home, me friends and me relations.
Wheelbarrow runs were the only way to get waste out of a cutting. It was heavy and dangerous work. On the line from Liverpool to Manchester, the navvies moved 3.75 million cubic yards of earth, stone and rubble, just for 30 miles. Imagine what that meant as the railway spread in the following years. An engineer on the London to Birmingham line reckoned they had moved enough earth to build a foot-high wall 3 times around the equator. Then there was actual building to be done. The Sankey Viaduct had to be built high enough to let the masted barges sail through on the Sankey Canal below. The canal owners insisted on that. So Stephenson built a viaduct of 9 arches. Each arch was 60 foot high and 50 feet wide. This is the old towpath of Sankey Canal. The canal used to run right through here. Mind you, it's been filled in for many years now, but the viaduct is still here and it still looks as impressive. The people behind the railway not only wanted to make money, they wanted to be part of a grand enterprise. They wanted the buildings to look stunning so as they could really show pride in what they were doing. Stephenson's Grand Arch over the line near Liverpool set the example that other companies had followed. The Moorish Arch, as it was called, was not just a piece of fancy showing off. It housed stationary steam engines. And this is all that's left of the Moorish Arch today. It's incredible to think that only 150 years ago this place was the real heart of the Liverpool and Manchester line. These steps here led up to the engine rooms, and below here was the boiler house and coke stores. The engines were here so that cables could pull up trains from the docks. The winding mechanism was built under the tracks here, so that a system of pulleys in here could pull a train 1.5 miles away through that middle tunnel from the docks. To get down to the docks, the trains just roll down the slope by gravity. We don't often think of stationary engines. We always think of locomotives, engines on wheels. But in the early days of the Liverpool and Manchester line, no one was quite sure of the best possible way to move trains around with fixed or moving engines. So they decided to set up a competition. The company advertised locomotive trials at Rainhill. They offered £500 to the engine which was the most successful. Replicas of the original engines have recently been built. At Rainhill there were 3 serious competitors. Sans Per Eye was built at the Stockton and Darlington Railway by Timothy Hackworth. When it was coupled to loaded carriages, it did all right at first. It managed 14 miles an hour for 2 hours, but then it developed a crack in the cylinder and had to retire. Novelty was the lightest of the engines and became the crowd's favourite. This explosive little machine managed a speed of 30 miles an hour, but it too broke down. Then, of course, there was the rocket, built by George Stephenson and his son Robert. It managed unloaded speeds of 32 miles an hour and ran 70 miles with carriages at about 16 miles an hour. The rocket triumphantly carried off the £500 prize, and so it was 8 Stephenson engines that took part in the official opening in September 1830. The orders for the visiting guests on that day were detailed and clear, and the engineman had clear instructions on how to signal by flags, how to start and how to stop. Speed limits and distances between trains were laid down exactly. But despite all these precautions, one of the guests, William Huskisson, a Liverpool MP, was knocked down by the rocket and killed. The death emphasised the need for strict control of passengers and very strict discipline for staff. For railwaymen, a thick rule book was introduced, and anyone disobeying it was either fined or sacked. It was necessary for efficiency as well as safety. Lots of different people had to work together: signalmen, enginemen, clerks and so on. Just as in the early days of the factories, people needed to learn a new approach for work. A good example of that was the rule on drinking. A canalman could wander along the canal and every hour or so pull into a public house and have a drink. For the navvies who worked on the railway, a ration of beer was part of their weekly wage. But for railwaymen, drink was absolutely forbidden. Anyone found drinking was given the sack. And passengers too had to be controlled. The first stations had no platforms, and passengers treated the trains like stagecoaches with no sense of danger. Later, platforms became standard. They helped passengers get into the trains, but also kept them safely off the tracks. This is Edge Hill Station, which today is restored, and they claim it's the oldest station in the world still in use. Lime Street Station is 1.5 miles down through that tunnel, and trains used to be hauled up here by a stationary engine. But how could the guards at Lime Street let the engine house here know that they were ready to start? Well, first of all, they had a bell with a long piece of wire which could be pulled at Lime Street. But remember, Lime Street is 1.5 miles through that tunnel. Then they had a long tube which air could be pushed and would blow a whistle at this end. But clearly, though, a new technology was needed, and it came in 1839 when the electric telegraph was used on the Great Western Line. Communications between stations and signal boxes became fast and efficient. A network using Morse code spread across the country. It was started for the railways, but was soon used for all kinds of information and news. News agencies got a great boost. More and more news in local papers came from the national agencies based in London. By the end of the 19th century, the railway network was so dense and the trains so fast that daily papers printed in London could be seen in most provincial towns by morning. The railway was helping to make the world a whole lot smaller. Local differences were being ironed out. For example, time. This sundial, displayed here in Manchester's Liverpool Road Station, was accurate enough for telling the times of the trains locally, but nationally it was no good at all, as sundials tell different times in different places. Cornish time was 20 minutes behind London time. So, for a national rail timetable to work, that's one thing they had to sort out. In the end, all clocks were standardised to match London time, which became known as railway time. A single standard over the country, ignoring local differences. The station at Liverpool Road, Manchester is no longer in use, but it's being restored and rebuilt. This was the first passenger terminal ever. In here came the first Manchester passengers holding one of these, a handwritten ticket issued by the clerks at the Society's offices. Everything was run as though it had been run for travel on stagecoaches. The first-class passengers had their own separate entrance to the station, their own comfortable waiting room, and believe it or not, their own grand stairway up into the trains. Soon enough, they'll have it looking like it was in 1830. A railway director was asked about travel for the poorer classes. He said, "We will probably send carriages once a day, perhaps with merchandise. Carriages of inferior description at very slow speed, and perhaps, too, it may only be done at night." The first-class trains on the Liverpool and Manchester line were quite separate from the second class. They ran at different times and travelled non-stop. The first-class carriages were just like 3 stagecoaches joined together, and like on a stagecoach, the luggage was strapped on top, and also up there, that's where the guard sat to keep an eye out. This smashing replica was built 50 years ago. People used to climb up using folding steps, as in the beginning they had no platforms, but inside, sheer luxury. Oh. Heaven knows how they did it. Oh. As you can see, inside, 6 well-upholstered seats with comfy armrests. Oh, quite relaxing, really. Fare at that time was 7 shillings per person, which is half the cost of travelling by road and twice as fast. Mind you, second class was something completely different. Here you go, blue boxes they were called, and this is one of them. Very uncomfy way of travelling. In their heyday, they used to have hard wooden seats in here, and not only would you have to get all your friends in, but you'd also have to get all your luggage in as well. And, yes, no roof. Yes, not only would you get extremely wet, but there was also the likelihood of you being showered by hot ash and soot which came out of the locomotive in front. Mind you, this particular locomotive is the oldest working one in the world. This engine first pulled carriages on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1838. Within 20 years of opening the Liverpool and Manchester line, millions of people who'd never been more than a day's walk away from the home had travelled far and wide. The age of mobility had definitely arrived. The fare from Liverpool to Manchester in those days for second-class passengers was 4 shillings, about 1/3 the weekly wage of a cotton worker. Still, there was no shortage of travellers, especially as later on the fares got cheaper. An early objection to the railway was that it would increase travel by the working classes. Indeed it did. Within a year on the Newcastle-Carlisle line, travel between the 2 cities increased 11 times. Day excursions for ordinary people became cheap and easy. Seaside resorts like Blackpool and Brighton became popular. The first bank holidays were started to let people get away for the weekend by rail. Because of the ease of travel, soccer grew into a national game. Imagine that. There could have been no league table without the railways. They really did change everything. The writer John Ruskin said, "Your railroad, when you come to understand it, is only a device for making the world smaller."